Liberia. Oh, now, okay, I've now got, I'm being recorded. Can you just press continue and?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, yes, so we asked her if we could build a crematorium and we got permission. Now, the problem was that Liberia is a very Christian country and the traditions surrounding burials and funerals are very highly respected. So we were asking the whole communities across Liberia, please change your ways. And this was really problematic. You know, if we suddenly had to have Indian pyres, which I would like for my funeral, you know, in Barnstable, and, you know, the body is on and then you burnt and then it's very visual, you know, the whole of Barnstable would be absolutely up in arms. And so the equivalent was asking the people of Liberia to be cremated. And we also said, we're very, very sorry. We are on a main road. We cannot have visitors. We're chock-a-block. We are extending, we're doing work at night to extend the centre to be able to admit everybody. Because at this time, sadly, once we were full, we had to turn people away. And then we would arrive at the gate next morning and sadly find people who died there overnight. So the people who arrived had to say goodbye to their relatives at the gate. And that was a really important point. The ambulances would then come down to triage, where people would be dressed in full protective equipment. They would be assessed at triage. And our Liberian staff were so brilliant, they could look at somebody and say, yes, they're Ebola positive. They have an Ebola look. And that is skill, isn't it? Here they are getting ready. It takes 20 minutes to get this equipment on. You are checked by the guy who is not wearing the equipment, and he checks that absolutely no part of your skin is exposed, because of course the virus can get in through your eyes, your nose, through any little bit of skin that is exposed. Now, one night we heard that, please get ready. You've got 20 serious cases coming in. So we moved as many patients as we could. We set up the beds, and of course they had to be a metre apart. We got all the everything ready, you know, all the chlorine. Extra staff were called in. And what happened? An hour later, nothing. It was a hoax. So this is just some of the dilemmas that we needed to contend with. So you're admitted, you're going to suspect tent, and this is the guy holding the chlorine pump was waiting as the other guy, two guys, were taking blood samples. This was an exceptionally dangerous procedure, because if you had a needle stick injury, the likelihood of you becoming positive with Ebola, if the patient had it, was incredibly high. And so, you know, hats off to the phlebotomists who were highly trained to do this. Please note the parent in the blue gown and the little boy. We'll come back to that story in a minute. This is the little boy who was admitted with his mother, his aunt, and his cousin. Here he's looking at the camera. He's well nourished, he's breastfed, he's active, and he had no signs of the Ebola at all. However, his mother did, and his aunt. So at that stage, we were admitting people only if they had signs, three significant signs. And this little boy didn't, so we thought he might escape it. However, this is the hour before he started having a fever. After this case, we started admitting all children with mothers, because the breastfeeding goes on longer after a year old. And sadly, Ebola virus is transmitted in breast milk. I mean, how cruel is that? And so we knew after a while that all the children suffered from the disease. So we admitted all the children with the mothers, even if the children at the time weren't showing any significant symptoms. And then I went in, I took the little boy in, and this is how you get ready. The eyes, you notice the goggles, you have to get the headgear right underneath the goggles, and you have to be checked. Everybody has to be thoroughly checked. But just imagine wearing this, going inside a suspect or confirmed tent and seeing a child. I mean, the fear must be terrific. And so we put our names on the top of our hats. And so, you know, at least the adults could recognize who we were. And this is the little boy 3 weeks later. His mother died, his aunt died, his cousin died. He had no other family. He was malnourished, but more importantly, since his mother died, someone who was confirmed positive in the next bed to him took him over and looked after him. Then she was better and went home. She was discharged. Someone else took him over, but she became seriously sick, so he was cared for by a third party, and they too became sick and died. Within 3 weeks, this little boy had had 4 carers and was completely emotionally shut down. He was withdrawn, he didn't recover very well at all, he wouldn't eat. And so we were learning on the hoof here. We realised that the people who were wearing blue were survivors, and we realised that survivors would go home and not be accepted in their villages. This little boy, even though he was getting better, would not be accepted in his village. So these survivors and the little boy were displaced through disease. So we employed the survivors, and at the time we didn't think you could get Ebola twice, so they could wear what's called light PPE, light protective clothing. And of course the temperature here was in the 40s, early 40s, so the survivors could work in light PPE long days. They would work 8 to 10 hours, and they would be the main carer for the children. And this worked incredibly well, and the little boy picked up. But sadly, he then needed to go to an orphanage, so he would have other carers. When I left 2 months later, there were 160 children who were orphaned. They were displaced. They could not go back to their village. Their relatives would not care for them because of fear. They were so frightened that the children would be infected again. Then one day I was asked, would I go in and see 2 pregnant girls, one who was only 24 weeks pregnant and one who was fully at full term. And the girlie at full term was contracting. So I went in, and the first day I went in, and she was fine. I assessed her, and she was contracting reasonably well. I went in that evening, and sadly, the shock when we went in, she was gurgling, she was deeply unconscious, gurgling on her own secretions and fitting. You have to wear 3 pairs of gloves when you're delivering a baby. And when I put my hand on her abdomen, the heat came through 3 pairs of gloves. She was severely pyrexial. Sadly, we knew there would be nothing we could do. We did think the baby might be expelled because she was still contracting, but no, she died and the baby died. And those experiences spread through Liberia. And so it just exacerbated the fear. And of course, along with fear comes ignorance. I'm coming out here, and actually the hygienist with the bare hands should have had gloves on, but he responded very quickly because I'd stayed inside for longer than I should, well over an hour, and I was just about to pass out. And here I am getting very angry because the gown would not get over my boots. And then you have to recover. And people knew that it was dangerous to go in, but they were far more frightened of the people who may recover or may die. So much so that this guy, Orlando, the guy whose hand I got on his shoulder, came out. He was critically ill when he was admitted, and we couldn't believe that he survived. And he got a certificate to say he was a survivor. and he was going home, and he was absolutely ecstatic. Now, the people standing around are called hygienists. The hygienists act as nurses. In many, many countries, you don't have nurses. If you get admitted to a hospital, what happens is that your family carers go in. They take your food, they take your clean clothes, they change the bed, they wash you, they give you your medication, but they do not have trained nursing staff, the carers do. But you see, with Ebola, we couldn't have the family carers in. So we had to employ hygienists, and there were 800 hygienists. This was the largest mission we had ever done at the time. And so my role as health promoter in this situation was speaking to the hygienists, and it was absolutely fascinating because I could ask them, what's going on in the outside world? What's the news on the gossip line around Liberia? Who's saying what? Who believes what? What do you believe? And they believed that even though Orlando was now clear of Ebola, they did not believe that I would shake his hand with my bare hand. And I said, yes, he's completely safe and he can go back to his village. And they said, well, we won't touch him. So I said, okay, well, I will get Orlando in and he will come in and thank you because you're the team that was on when he was admitted. So you were partly responsible for saving his life. Orlando came in, he was so happy and he was so bubbly. I shook his hand, put my hand on his shoulder, and then all the team did the same. And this is how you often get over stigmatization. You do it yourself. You model what everyone else can do that is safe to do. And then, okay, we got over that hurdle. However, we didn't get over the hurdle in the village. Orlando went back to his village, happy as anything, looking forward to seeing his relatives. And we had to bring him back in an MSF car, back to the centre, because he was not accepted. And that, just imagine, the despair when you've got the disease, the excitement when you've got over the disease, and then the dismay and the huge disappointment when nobody wants you anymore in your village. So he came back, and after 3 weeks, he had a mental health assessment. He was fine and cleared, and he came and worked in the centre for us. And so something else that we did was we got everyone from outside who was in a position of power to come into the centre, and we talked to them. We really wanted to address the issue of stigmatization, because stigmatization is brought about by prejudice, and it's a form of persecution. And many of our survivors were persecuted, and persecution leads to displacement. You no longer belong. And so people, after diseases, or if you suffered a disease like Ebola and recovered, you have to go and live elsewhere. You have to take yourself away and even out of country and start a new life again. So these are a group of midwives, and as a midwife, I was very concerned because midwifery, you know, there's plenty of blood and body fluids which carries the Ebola virus. And these people, bless them, had stopped working. However, that presented another problem. We had so many women coming in obstructed labour that needed caesarean sections, and no one would do a caesarean section because it was just too dangerous. And at that time, we didn't have the facilities. So there were many, many deaths. So you can imagine the belief systems that went around about Ebola, and also the belief systems that we couldn't cure it. 33% of our patients survived. And while I was talking to the women and the hygienists, I said, you know, what's happening? What do people believe in your community? And the people believed Ebola was caused by 3 things. Some believed it was God's punishment for the Civil War 10 years earlier. Some people believed that the United States wanted to stop their aid, and so they had sent it over as germ warfare. And other people believed, thanks to the World Service, where they published that kidney donors were desperately needed in the UK. And the Liberians said, aha, that's what's happening. They're admitting our patients and removing their kidneys. Now, some of those we could explain quite clearly, you know, especially about the kidney donations. But many people in the town were fleeing to relatives in the country. They were displacing themselves. And when they got to the country, of course, if they were infected, they were spreading the disease. And then they went to Guinea, and then they went to Ivory Coast. And so the whole disease was just transmitted right across West Africa. So displacement is dangerous, not only for the individual, but for the entire community. And because we didn't have any nurses, I had to train the health hygienists to how to handle unconscious and seriously sick patients. If you're going to work for MSF, or you're going to work for anybody in the developing world, there's a phrase that is frequently used as a symptom. Okay, what's your problem? Body ache. It's not a phrase that we're used to in England, but body ache is a very familiar term used just when when we have terrible flu and we ache all over. That is a sign and a symptom of many tropical diseases. So I'm here doing my Unconscious Patient Act, and we are teaching people how to roll patients, how to be kind, because up to that point, when I went inside, I noticed that the staff were pulling the patients up by their hands. They had no idea how to handle a patient. So every time we sort of thought we were over one hurdle, something else presented itself. And so we were teaching safe care. And then our brilliant psychologists, because there were, as you can imagine, there were loads of mental health problems, designed this wall, and they let all the survivors choose their paint, have their hands painted. If they wanted their names on the wall, they could do. And everybody could leave a sign of success when they left. However, that sadly wasn't the end of the story. They frequently needed to escape from their village, and they just became displaced people in their own country. This is all the information, if anybody wants it, on Ebola. Okay, I think Will's organised questions for the end of the sessions. So we'll just quickly go from one really hot country to another absolutely fascinating country. 6 months in Afghanistan was just the most brilliant experience I've ever had. And this time I was working with displaced people and refugees who had fled the war in poor old Afghanistan. It does not get some war. And they'd gone over to Pakistan. They'd stayed in refugee camps for 20 years, and then they had been returned by the United Nations to the border with Afghanistan, and then people had to make their own way home. This was up in the north near Kunduz, which you may have heard of. And so they walked for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now, if you are a breastfeeding mother, in this country, you need 600 extra calories a day to keep your breast milk supplied to keep the baby growing adequately. You can imagine the mothers were walking and walking and very little food, and the babies became severely malnourished. When they arrived back in Afghanistan, it was winter. And I told you my bedroom was -20. Here, outside, it was -30. And this is a group of displaced people who have returned. That is certainly not the end of the problems. It's beginning of a whole set of other problems. And I've got a question for you that I'd like you to answer at the end. The mountains in the background, mountains in Afghanistan are stunning. These mountains have villages in their valleys. And this group of displaced people, refugees, could go back to their village. They could walk. Okay, they've got very poor footwear, but we could have provided them with that. But something stopped them. And I'd just like you to have some idea of what you think stopped and prevented them returning to their villages. We then realised that when the refugees returned, that many of the children were malnourished, but also something else. Many of the mothers had been de-skilled. In refugee camps, it's dreadfully undignified. Sometimes you have to queue for the toilets in the morning, the showers, if you're lucky enough to get a shower frequently. You have to then often queue for breakfast or queue for food, queue for clothing, and Q for health. And sometimes you get so depressed that you just can't, you just don't want to. So anyway, when the mothers knew they were returning home, they were ecstatic, but they had been away for 20 years. And so many of them had forgotten how to cook or didn't know how to cook. And for childcare, they had become de-skilled. So here we are with, we opened a feeding centre. This was our day-to-day feeding centre. It wasn't residential. And we opened the centre because there were 2,500 children in the area under 5 who were severely malnourished. But we came across many other things. I was asked to go in because in life over here, I'd been a health visitor. So I knew about babies and children. And they said, the problem is, Flowa, that the children can be on the programme for 6 weeks. We're giving them food, all the nutrition that they need, but they're not gaining weight. So we want you to go in and assess everybody and see what's happening. And I thought, well, you know, if you've got a heart condition, you don't gain weight. If you've got an underlying syndrome or something chronic, then you don't gain weight. But 2,500 children under 5, you know, they can't all be that seriously sick. So we assess them all. This little baby has got something that used to be many moons ago, the scourge of SfGH, special care baby units, and in this country, and it's called pemphigus neonatorum. If anyone's heard of it, please just let me know at the end. It's a Staph aureus skin infection, and it can be cured with antibiotics if given as soon as it's identified. Sadly, for this adorable little boy, it wasn't identified. And in many, many countries, healthcare is not free. MSF is very popular and very respected because, of course, we offer free healthcare. And we're neutral, so we offer it to everybody. It doesn't matter what your race, colour, creed, religion is. And we are completely independent. So no other organisation finances, no government finances us, so we can do and practice how we like without strings. So this little boy came to us, and it's iodine, and that's what they were using there. He'd had every antibiotic, but the blisters would return, and he was just in a terrible state. He got such a loving, caring mother. We just felt dreadful that we couldn't help him. So this is our health promoter, the only girl on the team. Everyone else was male. And so I said, right, okay, let's look at this. 12% of the children had congenital abnormalities. So those 12 were given special cards, bit of pink plastic, that they waved when they came in. So they weren't weighed and measured. They went straight through. We gave them a separate room where we taught the mums physiotherapy, and we prepared the mothers for the fact that no matter how much food we gave, we still gave them food, but no matter how much food we gave, their little ones would never gain weight, and they would never, their conditions would never improve. So we were really honest with the mothers, and they became good friends and good supportive group, and they stayed with us for as long as we were there. I was there for 3 months. So this health promoter, I said to her, okay, Flower, we're giving all this food, we're giving soya and lentils and chickpeas and dried milk and sugar and vitamins and everything that is grown locally. But how do they cook it? You know, I don't know any Afghan recipes. And she smiled and she said to me, Flower, I'm not married, so I don't know how to cook until I'm married. My mother-in-law teaches me to cook. So I said, fine, okay, so we'll ask the guys. And the guys just looked at us and said, Flower, we don't cook. Our wives cook. So there we were, 2,500 children, and nobody knew how to make the food up for the babies. So we asked the mothers and said to the mothers, okay, so how are you making the food up for your babies? And they said, oh, we don't give it the babies. Oh, we couldn't possibly give it the babies because the babies are too small, right? Okay. So we checked all the babies over and said, how old is your baby? And of course, nobody's got a date for birth. It's around a festival. And so this little baby, still swaddled, they're swaddled, you know, wrapped tightly in clothes until they're 3 months. This little one was standing on his feet. When he opened his mouth, he got an array of teeth. So he was well nearly 1 year old. But his mother said, we can't feed him because he isn't heavy enough. Now, they knew the babies had to be a certain weight and a certain heaviness before they could be fed. But in the refugee camp, they'd been given food for the babies. So they had no idea how to make the supplies and the rations that we gave them up for the babies. Oh no, they said, we don't give them the babies. They're not big enough. We put it in soups and casseroles and bread for the rest of the family. And this is something really important that I really learned in Afghanistan, well, everywhere. Get to know the traditions and the culture of the community. If it's a sharing community, Afghans share everything. They even shared chai, their tea, with the English soldiers. And I have had that direct from a soldier. When they met, they shared. They have to welcome you. They have strangers are like friends that you don't yet know. And so the food went to the whole family, which was one explanation why the babies weren't gaining weight. The other explanation was that, of course, the mothers didn't know how to make the food because in the refugee camps, they'd just been given packet food for their children up to now. So you can see the aghast look on the health promoter's face. You'll also note that I'm holding the baby. I'm not feeding the baby. I'm not taking over the mother's role. I'm holding the baby so that the mother, we persuaded one lovely mother to let her baby, the oldest baby we could find, have the soup, the porridge that we'd made. It took us ages to get the porridge right, but when we had got it right, we could teach the mothers. And this lovely mother gave us her baby and said, yes, okay, we'll feed him. And thankfully, he gained weight the following week. She then took on the role of training everybody else, which is what we try to do, skill share. We don't take over. We go along with what the tradition is. We find out what they would normally do. And if there's a gap in the learning, then we fill it and we help others explain it and try. And then these mothers, the mother on the left who is feeding the baby is letting the mother hold the baby, but she said, no, I'll feed the baby. This child is 2, the baby, and was still breastfed totally. So that worked. This lovely mother with her bag of food, that's how heavy the supplies are. Look at her shoes, bless her. You can always tell a refugee or a displaced person by their shoes. They're usually hanging off in threads. This little girl is 4 and she was breastfed, but not totally. She had some food, but not sufficient. So once the mum had been taught, this little one absolutely romped away. And of course, once you've got one child who is succeeding, then, word spreads and the children's weight just gained rapidly. But then we came that we could close the feeding centre. Now, closing anything is incredibly difficult because the community feel abandoned. But we had a time limit on how long we could do it. And of course, 12% of children were like this little one. This little one, of course, is hydrocephalic. And we couldn't help this little one at all. So we explained to the mother and we explained to all the, as I've said, all the mothers. But we really needed to explain to the fathers. Again, the culture. The father is the head of the household. And so I said, right, before we finish and before we close the centre, I must see all the fathers of the children with syndromes and chronic illnesses. So they said, well, that's a bit dangerous, Flowa, because actually you are not supposed to speak directly to men. So another thing that MSF is very, very hot on, and that's security. So we went through all the security procedures. The vehicle was outside the gate, engine revved, facing in the right direction in case I needed to get a quick getaway. Behind all the doors of the centre, there's the male staff just ready to come out in case his father got very upset. I mean, we know from living in England recently, don't we, that Great Ormond Street have had a terrible time with parents who get incredibly upset when you say there isn't a cure for the babies. So an English person telling an Afghan father that there's nothing I could do for your baby could lead to trouble. So we prepared for it. I did say, if you can find me a father who speaks some English, then I will speak to the father on my own. The team weren't happy, but I was, because I thought if I do it with the team, then, you know, we could have a prolonged argument. This father was superb. They couldn't have found me a better father. He accepted it, and he said, I'm so pleased you told me, because our village was saving up. When MSF closed and our baby was no better, the village said, we will get funds together and send the baby to Kabul. And I said, even if your baby was in England, Flower, we couldn't help your baby. He'd got a cerebral cry, high-pitched cry. He got cerebral irritation, and there was nothing we could do. And I prepared the father that, you know, the baby wouldn't live very long, and the baby died 2 days later. But the father sent a message to say, don't worry, Flower, I will tell the other fathers, I will support the other fathers. Thank you for telling me the truth. Now, that little one had been in a refugee camp, had come back, and he was absolutely, seriously sick. But it was the personal touch that did it. And this is another problem with refugee camps. I've worked in refugee camps that have been 35,000 patients strong. And unless you have got very good staff, like MSF staff, it wasn't an MSF refugee camp, you know, healthcare, and they just lived, and they could also live in Pakistan just with relatives, but healthcare would be far too expensive. So he'd been displaced, he'd come back thinking all his problems were over, and then his little one died. Now let's bring it right up to date, shall we? This is what we are doing as MSF right at this moment. We are in the Mediterranean. This is MOAS boat that we take over. We rent a MOAS boat. We provide our staff, but we keep the MOAS staff, Migrant Offshore Aid Station. We have worked with 5 boats this year, and in 5 months, 5 of our boats have been impounded in Italy. People do not want refugees. We know the problem that we face in England with refugees, and people are displaced for a variety of reasons, and they often get to Libya and then to Turkey and then do the crossing from Turkey. A crossing that would cost you and I €48 costs the refugees £2,000. On board ship, there's a hospital, and we provide the hospital staff. Here we are looking out to sea to try and spot a boat. We see a boat. The boats that they set off in, that the traffickers charge for setting off, are not good boats. They all leak. This one is listing terribly. There are 613 people on this boat. This boat is listing, and everyone is about to drown. So this is how we carry out the rescues. We send the boats out with life jackets. Everyone has a life jacket, and for those who want to jump because they're so frightened, these are called centers, and they're what you can hang on to so you don't drown. The boat then searches, and the boats go backwards and forwards, taking staff and life jackets. There's a boat appearing just before the second wave comes. And what happens? We find at the bottom of the boats patients who are really ill and unconscious because they've been first on the boat and they've got near the fumes. And the first thing you do when a refugee gets onto one of our boats is to sniff them. Do they smell of diesel fumes or petrol? Because that can burn. That diesel on their skin with seawater causes terrible burns. And this is Simon, one of our English doctors, just checking that all the patients who have been found unconscious when everyone else has left the boat are safely on board. The boats are incredibly well equipped. This is the intensive care unit with our staff. And of course, there's babies. Babies are born on the boat. Children, just imagine being a child and you're at night on a boat and at sea. And what the refugees always say to me, numerous places I've worked, they've all said to me, if we'd have known what we had to go through and what we would be reaching when we got to Europe, we would have stayed and been killed in our own country. And this is what an Ethiopian poet wrote. No one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. This girlie is a nurse in Cameroon, from Cameroon, and she worked for 2 years with no money. So she decided she was the strongest. She would leave the family and she would set off and try and earn wages because she'd heard that Europe was short of nurses. We don't know whether she was raped in Libya. The women are raped when they're in detention in Libya, and the men are persecuted. We don't know whether she was raped in Libya or she was pregnant when she left home, but she delivered the baby on board ship. We found this lovely Afghan lady who'd walked over the mountains. She was on her own. Now that is a mystery in itself. Women never go out on their own in Afghanistan. So we don't know whether the men died, the men were killed, or she was just left behind because she was slow at walking. But if anybody wants to identify what this problem is here, just let me know afterwards. And this is what displaced and refugee people meet when they get to Europe. The EU spent £7 million on this wire netting, double wire netting. And in Idemania, where I worked on the Macedonian border, when they closed the border, if you did manage to get over the wire netting, you were impaled on spikes. You can see the sea that brought you from your homeland, but you can't see any way out. And refugees and displaced people feel abandoned and that there is just no hope, no dignity and no hope. And there are many, many unaccompanied children. So if you are wondering what you can do to help this situation right now, today, well, I have the answer. Lord Dubs, you may have heard Lord Dubs, who himself was a refugee, has just got an Amendment 7 passed through the House of Lords to safeguard family reunions and to secure safe routes for unaccompanied children. There are loads of unaccompanied children in Calais and in Moria that you've heard probably to talk about today. And this amendment goes to the House of Commons on Monday. So if you want to write to your MP today, your Plymouth MP, go on the MSF website and it will, current dilemmas, go and look under current dilemmas, and there it would tell you how you can write your letter. Don't do it word for word because they don't read these word for word things, unfortunately. But go on the website today and just put in your own words. Please, will you allow unaccompanied children, displaced children, refugee children to come into the UK? We've got plenty of space for them. They have family here. Please reunite them with their family and stop them roaming, stop them being picked up by paedophile rings, stop them being trafficked, stop them living hand to mouth where their tents are set on fire in Calais and where tear gas is thrown into their tents. Stop all that and pass this amendment, please. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. We really appreciate it. It was so good. Thank you. But yeah, we have some 2 questions for you, if you don't mind answering them.
I'd love to.
In the Q&A. So the first question is, what sort of overseas field experience did you have before applying to MSF?
Well, when my children were teenagers, I was hoping they would have the travel bug like me. Sadly, they didn't, and sadly, they still don't. So instead of them having a gap year, I had a gap year for them. So I worked in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, as a midwife. I then set off to travel for a year through Southeast Asia. And when I reached India, I'd heard that there was an English doctor, Dr. Jack Prager, working on the streets of Calcutta. So I found him out, and he was seeing 600 patients a day from 6 in the morning, the clinic opened till 6 at night, but they didn't have anyone who was specialising in paediatrics. So I set up a paediatric unit, and we got paediatricians from the hospital. I worked there for 3 months during the monsoon period. I don't suggest you go to India during the monsoon period, wading waist high through sewage in freezing cold water. But, you know, patients came and I got great experience there. And then I went back home and thought, yes, I really want to work not only in development, but in with MSF in you know, really emergency medicine. So I did my tropical diseases, and because I'd worked in Calcutta, I'd actually worked in Calcutta 6 times. I used to take a month's holiday from the NHS and go out, and then I would take 6 months unpaid leave and go and work in Calcutta. So MSF likes you to have plenty of experience overseas, working with different cultures in preferably a medical setting. The tropical diseases is absolutely imperative. So I trained in Liverpool to do my tropical diseases. And then the first place I went was Liberia, where we had a yellow fever outbreak and cholera. And then I did South Sudan and Afghanistan and Ethiopia and Sierra Leone and then Liberia again. So I can't say how important it was for me to get the experience before I applied to MSF with cultural differences, rough living, living with people who had completely different thoughts, feelings, values, standards, and basically roughing it. And cutting my teeth on diseases that you will never see in this country. And then once you've got your tropical diseases, you know, you're just raring to go. Now MSF likes you to have French or Arabic as a second language, and then you don't need a translator. And why don't you need a translator? Well, when I was in Ethiopia 2 years ago, the Amharic is the local language, and then there's a local dialect, and then there's branches of the local dialect. So I would speak in English to my interpreter. He would speak in Amharic to the patients. They would then try and translate it into 2 different languages. So I would ask, you know, how many babies have you borne? This, you know, this is far easier than how many pregnancies have you had? How many babies have you borne? And the answer would come back, we've had no vaccinations. So you think, right, so we're in translation, we've got lost. So if I could have spoken Amharic, or if I was in Goma in Congo, where, you know, I was fluent in French, I wouldn't need a translator. And then you can get an accurate answer. So I have tried to learn French. I'm rubbish at languages, about as good at languages as I am with computers. However, I'm really trying because I really want to go to Congo. Is that helpful? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that was an amazing answer. Thank you so much.
Great.
And just the last question, how did MSF try to mitigate the mistrust of healthcare during the epidemic? And what did they do differently to other INGOs?
Well, the thing was that there were no other aid agencies there. Where were our partners? We were the only ones. And from March 2014, we were shouting, this is serious in Liberia. You know, this is spreading. We can't stop this. We need help. You know, we could have done with someone to look after the children. We could have someone, you know, who could deal with relatives. We did deal with the relatives, not deal with them, but, you know, we dealt with the problems of relatives, and we had a grief counsellor. But, you know, we could have done with some assistance. We had 80 international staff on our team from across the world. Again, the largest international staff team we've had at that time. So there was no other one. And I think it's fair to say that I can tell you that the World Health Organization, when we went to them repeatedly, they just said, is MSF panicking? And there were over 11,000 deaths at the end of the epidemic. So there was nobody else there. How we got over it, right, that was part of my job. We called everyone in, you know, pastors, counsellors, everybody important, faith healers, ministers, anybody in the city who was important, and we spread the word through them. They would then go back and tell their congregation on Sundays, and they would preach it. We had a preacher come in, and he spoke to relatives saying, you know, this is really serious, you need to do this. We had hygiene buckets. I don't know whether you saw the hygiene bucket. I can't get back to find the hygiene bucket, but the hygiene bucket contained 8 items. How can I get that one up? Never mind. And inside was gloves, 2 pairs of gloves, and a black bag, and a gown, and masks, and chlorine, and the bucket held 20 litres, so you could mix your chlorine up in it. And then you could go back and disinfect or treat the mattress and the flat or the room where the patient had taken ill, because of course that was, people live in very close communities, and that would further spread the disease. So we did that. We went out in the middle of the night by arrangement and took out for the women 1,000 of these kits every week, so that, you know, we spread the word through the women. And the reason we took it out at night was so that we wouldn't get flooded with people, and they still kept their meter distance. We would do a lot on mobile phones. We would call people on mobile phones. We went on the radio. The president was very, very supportive, so we worked through the president, and, you know, we just did as much as we possibly could with every avenue we could. What we didn't do that we did in Sierra Leone, once the outbreak calmed down in Sierra Leone, then we went into the communities and we addressed the problem of stigmatisation and what caused it, and the hygiene problems. Did that answer it, love? I never know whether I've answered the question properly.
Thank you so much.
Was that all right?
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that's it for the questions, if no one else.
Did anybody answer why the internally displaced people in Afghanistan couldn't go home to the mountains? Did anybody come up with an answer to that question? No?
No, I don't think, no one submitted anything. But,
nobody submitted anything?
No.
Well, it was because the Americans had left cluster bombs along the route. There was only one route into the mountains. The Americans had left cluster bombs, and the Halo Trust, which, you know, diffuses the bombs, had such a big job on it, that they couldn't get up into the mountains. They were doing the main routes, and so the people were stuck. They were back in their own country, but they weren't back in their own homes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, that's all. Thanks so much, Flowa. It was, yeah, an incredible talk. Really enjoyed it. So that's it for speakers today, and we'll be having a social at 4. So you've got a short break. If Wasifa is out, would you like to introduce the social? If Wasifa is there.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I think Rihanna just put up her hand. Rihanna,
yeah, sorry. I just wanted to flag for everyone that the link to write to your MP about Monday's vote on family reunion and the Dubs amendment that was just talked about is in the chat. I'll just post it again. But it allows you to just very quickly write to your MP. Yeah, it doesn't take very long.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. That's really good. Thank you.
Take a break.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thanks so much again. It's been a fantastic speech and a fantastic day. So we'll take a break now, and the social will begin at 4. It's going to be fantastic. It's a really good evening planned by Wasif. So yes, we'll take a break and come back at 4.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Flowa.